speaker, who is adjunct professor at Curtin's School of Media, Creative Arts and Social Inquiry. That's Joseph Siracusa. Joe was formerly Professor of Human Security and International Diplomacy at RMIT University. He was born and bred in Chicago, and you'll soon hear about that, but he's been resident in Australia since 1973. He's worked at University of Queensland and at Griffith University and, of course, at RMIT. He's been with Curtin now for about 18 months, I think. He's got many areas of interest and expertise, nuclear weapons technology, international security, global diplomacy. We could have asked him to talk about any of those things, especially with the latest developments in terms of AUKUS and other things like that. And we might even talk about that potentially today, who knows. But his other great interest and love, of course, is the American presidency. And that's why we're particularly interested in having him talk to us today. He's a regular commentator in Australia and international media on American politics. He's also co-authored or co-authored, can you believe this, more than 30 books. I'm incredibly jealous. He must have an unbelievable work ethic and somehow finds time to write all those books. So we were very fortunate last year, about this time last year, Joe spoke to us at a Curtin Corner talking about the election with Donald Trump and Joseph Biden. So we got his wisdom then, and now here we are. It seemed only fitting, here we are almost a year later, to have him back again to discuss how Biden's been going and travelling since that election and since his inauguration in January. So Joe, once again, it's a great privilege to have you here. I'm very pleased that you've volunteered to give us a talk on the Biden presidency. We'll leave it to you, about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then Q&A, and then we'll try and get the whole thing wrapped up by about 10 past 5 our time, which is 10 past 8 your time, because we don't want to eat all the way into your evening. So thank you yet again for agreeing to speak to us. Over to you.
Okay. Well, John, I've been locked down for 18 months, so it's easy to get a lot of work done. Can't go anywhere. Can you hear me?
We can
Yes, perfectly fine.
Okay, no, there was silence there. I thought maybe.
No, it's all good.
Now, look, it's an honor and privilege to be with you this evening. As Ronald Reagan used to say at my age, it's a privilege to be anywhere. So it's always fun to talk about American politics. I've spent my whole life looking at it, living it. Joe Biden is my 14th president. I've written about all of them. I lived through all of them, except for Franklin Roosevelt. I didn't know. I mean, I was a child when he was born. When I was just born when he was going through his fourth administration. Now, I know there are a lot of people who can talk about Joe Biden. You could go to Channel 9 or Sky, and there's always some expert there who's got an angle on this. Now, I have a very unique angle on Joe Biden. And before I get into what he's been doing or not doing or what he should be doing, I want to tell you what my angle is. My angle is Joe Biden and I are the same age. We lived through the same experiences. We've seen the same things when we were at college. We were part of the 27 million Americans who'd come up draft age in the 1960s. We'd seen the debacle in Vietnam. We'd seen the Iranian crisis. We'd seen 125 cities in America burn as a result of the civil rights protests. We saw the women's movement, the anti-war movement, and the anti-mental health movement. We saw all this. And we also had the privilege of experience as youngsters, John Kennedy's New Frontier, and of course, Lyndon Johnson's breathtaking Good Society. And I know Biden saw all this, and he saw more. He saw Richard Nixon travel to Beijing in February 1972 and cut a deal on Taiwan, which is essential to understand today. We know that he saw Taiwan de-recognized in December 1979. We know he put up with Ronald Reagan and everything that went on in the 1980s, and I know exactly what he saw. So I'm going to hold him accountable to what he saw and try to explain his behavior. I think it's important when you want to understand a politician, not just to talk about what they're doing or what they've just done, or what they ought to do, but what the whole experience. I mean, what does he know is right or wrong, or what has he seen work or not, et cetera. And I'm going to help locate him a little bit. Now, Joe Biden made two promises to the American people. Number one, he returned the presidency to some kind of normalcy. This is not to say that Donald Trump got it all wrong. I mean, Donald Trump wasn't good or bad. He was quite different for a president. He was an inexperienced politician. I don't think he held office anywhere. And so when he got to the presidency, every night was, well, what could I call it? Amateur hour. And he made a lot of fits and starts, and he was doing pretty well for a while, and then he fell on his face, and he managed to get impeached twice, which is quite a trick, as a matter of fact. So but Biden promised the American people some normalcy, but he had to beat a lot of people for the job. You know, this is a job he's been trying to get all of his life. For different reasons, he had to back off, and he was beaten by some better people, and his time had come. He's 78 years old, and he's probably the oldest president we've had in office, and I don't think he's going to be running a second time. So that was his first promise. And his second promise is he promised the American people he would bring a level of competency to the office. So he's going to return the American people to, or the office and the American people, some kind of normality or normalcy. And he's going to show them that he has some competence. And he's got two big goals. Number one, he wants to reestablish America's place in the world in the area of foreign policy. That's one of his big goals, to make America credible again. And number two, he wants to domestically unify the country around major legislation. So it's not hard to understand what he's trying to do. He made a number of promises, and I'm not going to buy any of this story that he doesn't know what he's doing anymore, et cetera. He looks perfectly normal to me. He's my age group. He looks perfectly normal. So the point is, he has a number of promises, and he wins this election by a large amount. He says he has a mandate to do certain things. Well, what is this mandate? It is a razor-thin edge in the House of Representatives. And he has a razor-thin edge in the U.S. Senate, 50-50 with the vice president serving as president of the Senate, breaking the vote. So his mandate's going to be restrained a little bit. And, so he's got to deal with the institutional things. Now, the whole time that he's operating, he has to deal with an American public which is alienated from Washington. 10 years ago, Pew Research showed that only 2 Americans in 10 had any faith in Washington. Pew Research this week shows that only 2 Americans in 10 have any faith in Washington. So Americans aren't expecting much from Congress. That's how President Trump got elected. He was going to represent all those Americans who didn't believe in what Washington was trying to do, et cetera. And so he has to deal with a very skeptical public. Now, initially, he gets very high ratings in his first 100 days because he's able to effect a COVID legislation package, which is very extensive. He says he has a handle on COVID. In fact, what he says to the American people is, I have safe hands. You're safe in my hands. Donald Trump wasn't quite sure about how he wanted to go with COVID. And I'm not going to blame any politician for controlling or not controlling COVID. COVID is just a tsunami coming through, like the Spanish flu. It just wiped it, went across the world, killed 50 to 100 million people, and then it stopped. And with the COVID, there's only so much you can do. Of course, Australia has a very different approach than the president did at the time. And he was going to get everything back to normal by July. Well, he got high marks for that. He got very good approval ratings. But in recent polls, the last couple of weeks, he's underwater. 31% in one poll, 35 in another, favorability rating. Most Americans say he's not doing the job well. And why is that? And that is because he really can't control Congress. He's got a couple wonderful bills. One of them is an infrastructure bill, which is very important. If any of you have been to America and been down America's side roads or across some of the bridges across the Mississippi, you can see that America has to do a little work there. I remember talking to a Chinese a government official in the 1960s who was traveling through America. He thought American cities were in terrible shape. Well, they were in terrible shape. And a lot of them haven't been repaired since then. So that's a good bill. And then he wanted to tie it up with what he called the human infrastructure bill. Now, human infrastructure is an oxymoron. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't fool anybody. What he wants to do is he wants to produce some legislation that will fill in some gaps. He wants to provide universal PK for parents, their kids in daycare on the way to kindergarten. He wants more money for Medicaid and Medicare. One, of course, is for the poor, and one is for the elderly. He wants to cover extend their coverage to eyeglasses, hearing aids, dental work, and stuff like that. Most people in the world, civilized countries, would regard this as ridiculous, but in America, there are a lot of people who are missing their teeth in West Virginia because they can't get any coverage for anything. They can't see properly, they can't hear properly, and this, of course, is what makes Senator Saunders so popular, because he's been arguing for these things. He also wants to deal with racial justice, and he wants to deal with saving the planet. Now, these are perfectly normal for Joe Biden. When Biden and I were young in college, we experienced some of the worst elements or the worst aspects of the civil rights movement. Terrible things were happening, and Lyndon Johnson tried to do something with the Civil Rights Act and the rest of it, but it wasn't enough to cover things, and America started to burn. And the civil rights movement sort of conflated with the anti-war movement. This is, of course, was Dr. Martin Luther King's big problem. Is while he was a great hero of the civil rights movement by throwing all of his energy into the anti-war movement, saying you can't have one without the other, he made himself an enemy of the Johnson administration, and a lot of enemies within the civil rights movement, pointing out that the majority of kids drafted among blacks, something like 19% of them were killed in Vietnam. And so at that time, there are millions of people who are drafted, and there are millions of people who are deferred. I was one of the deferred. I got drafted at the last minute. Joe Biden got deferred at first, and then he got a physical exemption. He had asthma, and I think Donald Trump had spurs on his foot or something. So these guys were going to war. No one really wanted to go. And 500,000 Americans went to Canada, which was a story all by itself. And so he understands that these wars that have no ending, he couldn't see our leaders at the time couldn't tell us why we were there, and they couldn't get out. And then Richard Nixon came along, and he saw this at firsthand. Richard Nixon had a plan to get out of the war. That's what he said to get elected. And of course, he didn't have a plan at all. And the last minute, Nixon had this bright idea of going to China to help ask the Chinese to get him off the hook in Vietnam, which is very clever, very unprecedented, as a matter of fact. It was a brilliant trip on the part of an arch-communist to show up in Beijing, cutting the deal with Mao and the premier Zhou Enlai. I'll talk about that in a minute. So Biden has seen the unpopularity of war. He has seen the gaps in civil rights, and he was there when the Kerner Commission released its historical report in 1968. The Kerner Commission is named after Governor Otto Kerner of the state of Illinois, my state. And like many, many other governors of Illinois, he went to prison later on for tax evasion. That's another story. And Kerner says in that report, which was also authored by Father Hesburgh at Notre Dame and others, that there was this racial gap in America, this equality gap that wasn't getting any better. It was only getting worse. And in that report, they asked for defunding of the police, reorienting of assets and that kind of thing. And they talked about systemic racism in America. In fact, all the things that are discussed today among American critics of social justice, racial justice. We're all discussing the 1960s, and President Biden knows it. He was there, he saw it, and a lot of these things were not acted on because there was no interest in it. And then when Richard Nixon got elected, he got elected as a law and order president in 1968. So everything that President Biden is dealing with today, whether it's China, racial justice, social justice, wars of necessity versus wars of choice, he saw it all. He saw it all close to him. And so I think that's important because one of the things we don't really talk about in American politics in America, that is, in analysis, is what people actually saw when they were younger. When Joe Biden was younger, he would have been a progressive in the Democratic Party. I was in the Democratic Party in my youth days, and we were progressives. That is, we didn't like the establishment politics of the city bosses like Dick Daley in Chicago. We didn't like party politics. We didn't like big city politics. We wanted to do something else. So he'd been a progressive. And one of the problems he has today is that while he's fighting his own progressives about what bill goes first or what goes in these bills, is that his heart is with the progressives, but his head is with the moderates at the center of the party. So he's conflicted all the time. You know, he knows that the progressives are trying to deliver on what's important. And I think what Joe Biden's trying to do, he's trying to fulfill the realization of Lyndon Johnson's policies, the Great Society. There are things that have to be done. And he wants to fulfill these things. He wants to give people an opportunity to do things. He wants to offer them free education, at least junior college, for a couple of years. And he wants to offer them tax credits and various opportunities. At the same time, he's trying to save the world. He's trying to get Americans to spend a lot of time and money on climate change and biodiversity too, and these kinds of things. He understands the importance of this. And so he's committed to all these things, but at the same time, he can't get his Congress to come up to him. He's got very stubborn people in the Republican Party. There's a senator in West Virginia and there's a senator in Arizona who don't want to give him everything he wants. And there are a number of people, congressmen and women who want more, as a matter of fact. And there's Bernie Sanders who wants more. And he's sort of conflicted. And what will he settle with? Which one goes first? And it's on this issue that he's received very low polls from the American people because he's not doing what he said he would do. He's not providing competency. He's not looking competent, and he's not unifying America, and he knows that. So he's behind the 8 ball. He's not real sure about what to do about it. And he's also at 6s and 7s about how to reestablish America's reputation abroad. He goes abroad and says, America's back. Well, once you've kicked the French president in the teeth, you can't blame Europeans for not believing you as you go around. He's having trouble to reestablishing Americans' bona fides in the international arena. And he's going to have a tough time doing that because they reckon, I think the Europeans reckon, and the Russians and Chinese and others, that America is tipping in a slightly different direction. It's not going to be isolationist. America has never been isolationist. What has been more unilateral and a little less loving and believing of their allies. Americans have always taken a very jaundiced eyes to their allies. After World War I, when the Allies wouldn't pay their debts, America refused to accept any of their immigrants. And when I was in college in the 60s, Senator Mansfield from Montana and Senator Hatfield, I think from Oregon, used to complain all the time that NATO was paying its fair share of the bills. So these arguments have been going on a long time. And so Biden is trying to reestablish America's bona fides in the world. He's having a tough time doing it because he hasn't been able to do the immediate things he wanted to do. He wanted to get back to the table with the Iranians, and that's not going to happen. He wanted to do something with the North Koreans, and that's not going to happen. And he wanted to reset the button with the Russians, and Vladimir Putin is not making that easy for him. But most of all, he wanted to reset the button with the Chinese. Now, it turns out with the Chinese, He's continuing the war on trade, which I regard as the poison. That is the thing that poisons everything in these trade wars. And he's trying to reestablish some kind of equilibrium with the Chinese. Now, my complaint about Biden is when he says the other day we learned through Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor, he's in Europe giving an interview, and he says, President Biden has had a 7-minute phone call with President Xi about Taiwan. And they agreed to adhere to the Taiwan agreement. And not a word was spoken about what the Taiwan agreement is. Biden knows exactly what the Taiwan agreement is. On February 27th, 1972, the Chinese and the Americans released a document called the Shanghai Communique, adhered to by President Nixon, National Security Advisor Kissinger, Chairman Mao, and Premier Zhou Enlai. And it says very clearly that America regards China as one country and Taiwan is part of one country. And the deal is this. Nixon and Kissinger, and then later on, American presidents do not expect the Chinese to initiate a violent takeover of Taiwan in exchange for the Taiwanese promise not to declare independence. That's the deal. That's the status quo since 1972. Kissinger and Nixon and Mao and Zhou Enlai took Taiwan off the table. And so today, when I see people around the world talking about the coming war with China, I'm astounded that no one explains to them that this has been taken off the table, that the American people are not going to go to war against China over Taiwan. They may over incidents in the South China Sea. If the Chinese are silly enough to sink an American warship or even an Australian warship, there'll be a war or there'll be a conflict of some kind. And because there's no way to deter Chinese from taking over Taiwan if the Taiwanese keep pushing the issue of independence. It's not on the cards. And what no one else talks about is that Taiwan's prosperity over the past 40 years or so has actually rested on the foundation of the Shanghai Communique. In other words, and they are who they are because of the communique. And in that 1972 communique, looked just like President Xi's speech the other day. The Chinese are calling for the peaceful reunification of Taiwan based on a historic mission, not unlike America's manifest destiny in the 19th century. They're telling the Taiwanese, it's one country and two systems. That is, they could have any business model they want. They could be capitalists or anything they want. They don't have to follow the Chinese. They don't have to follow socialism with Chinese characteristics, but they have to hand over their foreign policy to Beijing. Beijing does not want Taiwan to indicate to anybody that there is a chance to break away from China. And Xi has promised his party the reunification. In fact, he's made that very clear that that's part of the deal. He brought the hammer down on Hong Kong because he couldn't stand these people there and their expressions of freedom spreading this idea to the mainland. He didn't want those students to become martyrs in a counter-revolution. And the thing is, in all of this, President Xi does not represent a rising China. This is a myth about the recrudescence of the great powers, a rising China. Yes, China's become very powerful economically, but it's not a rising power. But it is a declining Chinese Communist Party. They are in panic mode. They have been in semi-panic mode since the collapse of the Soviet Union. They spent millions of dollars trying to establish what happened to Moscow-dominated communism. And President Xi knows that communist parties have a lifespan, that is running countries, of about 70 years. And even in terms of their older politics, there's a great study at Harvard, a multi-volume work that shows that of China's 249 dynasties, the average age is 70 years old. So he's racing against the clock. He's trying to reinvigorate the party, that is to pass on the party fervor to the next generation. It barely goes beyond 5 or 6 years. The Bolshevik party lasted 49 years. as the head of the government. So he knows there's a timeline here, and he knows also that everything's at stake. Everything's on the table. There are 90 million people who run or members of the Chinese Communist Party. There's a standing committee of about 20. There's about 5 people who make all the decisions. And he knows he's got to deliver on this because this is his way of establishing his primacy within the Chinese pecking order. And he knows he could be going. So he's got to deliver on this. And he's once again offered the Taiwanese this deal, peaceful reunification, whatever, put it off in the future. And the Taiwanese sort of knocked it back, and they talked about independence, and they talked about how a number of Western states a number of countries are coming on side with them, which is not only untrue, it's unhelpful because there are only 15 countries in the world that support Taiwan, including Tuvalu, Swaziland, and Switzerland. Taiwan the United Nations is not coming to the rescue of Taiwan. And in fact, President Biden knows there's going to be no war with China over Taiwan, despite these expectations around the world. I keep reading and hearing people talk about this war with China over Taiwan. Well, this is very dangerous nonsense. This is not going to happen. No one is going to fight for Taiwan in the United States. People in Peoria, Illinois, are not going to fight for Taiwan. It's just not going to happen. The United States would concede because if Taiwan breaks the deal, if it declares independence, then they have full authority to go in. Now, if California declared independence tomorrow, I can assure you, there'll be federal troops in Sacramento by tomorrow afternoon. So, it's the same deal. So that's not going to happen. But there are plenty of points of conflict in the South China Sea, particularly over freedom of navigation. What the Chinese do not understand is the United States will not tolerate the impediment to freedom of navigation. It's part of the American DNA since the Barbary pirates in the 1790s and fighting the British in the War of 1812. Americans regard open sea lanes or international sea lanes as part and parcel of their prosperity and future and all the rest of it. And so that's not going to happen. Now, the PLA Navy has received a lot of money over the last 5 years to take on the American Navy, and that's not going to happen either. They're not going to win that one. And they're going to learn the same lessons that the Japanese Navy learned in the 1930s, that no amount of money is going to defeat the American Navy. I mean, the American Navy is what this is all about. Now, the other day, President Biden and the Prime Minister of this country and Boris Johnson announced an alliance of some kind. I don't know what to call it. It really wasn't an alliance. The 1952 ANZUS is an alliance. This one doesn't have any clauses about coming to the aid of anybody. It's a deal. The deal is the United States is going to provide Australia and Britain. Britain and America will provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. Australians won't touch the nuclear fusion units on these boats. I don't know how that works exactly. And they're going to have access to American Tomahawk missiles. So these are going to be very powerful boats. Somebody in the Obama administration estimated a couple of years ago that would require about 3 nuclear-powered navies, to defeat and sink the Chinese Navy within 72 hours. That was the estimate in, I think, 2009 or something like that. So Australia will be part of this great effort to hold the Chinese at bay. Now, we're not going to win any war in near Chinese waters. They sink most of these ships right now because we don't have the ability to refuel F-35s or F-117s or whatever is in the air. We can't really fuel them. They're too close to the lines and we lose all that. Now, there are Americans, and Biden is supporting this a little bit, who would like to deter the Chinese before they decide to invade anybody. That is, to build up the Navy to a point where to stop them. But, they don't have enough time for this. Taiwan and other people, other pundits have been arguing that within 5 years, 6 years, the Chinese Navy, China will be able to invade Taiwan. Well, I got news for people. China can invade Taiwan tomorrow morning. and nothing's going to happen. They're just going to take over the place. This idea that it's 5 or 6 years down the road. My concern is, and Biden has played in with this, is that most of the American establishment is anti-Chinese right now. There's anti-Chinese legislation. The CIA is setting up a Chinese command post, so to speak, and all kinds of money is being spent on frustrating the Chinese. And the thing is, most of Washington is anti-Chinese because it's socially acceptable. It's the only thing Democrats and Republicans can agree on. So one of my problems with President Biden is, while he's trying to reestablish America's credentials overseas, he hasn't been very forthcoming on what's going to happen to Taiwan. At best, there's always a strategic ambiguity. That's good, keep people guessing, like the North Koreans guessing all the time. But I think he should be a little more straightforward before you get other people talking about what's going to happen to China if they invade Taiwan. America agreed in 1972, was certified again in 1979 with the recognition of Taiwan, that there is one China. Taiwan is part of China. End of the story. And anybody who gets that wrong is just up to nonsense, because it's not true. And to give that impression to the world, this might happen. Now, Macron was very angry with Australia and the United States, always angry with Britain. I mean, I was at a security conferences before all this COVID business, and it was quite clear that European diplomats and European bureaucrats had a gut full of Boris Johnson. They want nothing more to do with Britain, and the NATO people I talk to, they don't trust Britain because they reckon if Britain can't play the game in the EU, they don't want to play the game with them in NATO. So France is the natural leader there with its own nuclear weapons, and Macron has made it very clear that vis-a-vis China and the United States, he sees himself as the the balancing act. He wants to be the interlocutor. He wants to be the honest broker. He's going to make pretty sure that they don't come to blows over things. That was the role he had for himself. So when the president and Morrison and others announced this deal, Macron got sidelined, and he was made to feel very small. And as we know about the French, who have a great, glorious history, they don't want to feel small. And so it put him in a terrible position. It's not the money. $60 billion to the French is a drop in the bucket. They're not worried about that. They're worried about being sidelined for having a major role to play in that part of the world. Now, the president's ratings his approval ratings are very low. And I think it was 35% or 31% in Iowa poll taken. And I don't know if he's going to recover from this, but I am going to tell you what's going to happen. In November 2022, when and if the Republicans get a majority in the House, and historically the opposite party usually gets about 20 seats. All you need is 218 to do your worst. As soon as the Republicans get a majority in the House, as sure as God made little green apples, they're going to impeach Joseph Biden. And I think that's a waste of time. Unless there's a proper number in the Senate, it's a complete waste of time. And I think impeaching presidents has become the new blood sport in America. Nancy Pelosi went after President Trump after a phone call he had with the Ukrainian president, which is nothing. Historically, it's nothing. I'm not going to get into it, but I can tell you things that Franklin Roosevelt said to Joseph Stalin behind closed doors that we discovered through getting material or information later on that would have got him impeached. So, and then when they impeached him the second time for the protest that became a riot, that became an insurrection, and they weren't going to get him because they didn't have those. The point is, they're all going to go after each other. It's become kind of theater. Now, the majority of Americans really don't know who to turn to. And they're looking at this gerontocracy in America. Pelosi's in her 81, and Trump is 74, going to be 75, and this guy's 78 years old. And I have a hunch that we're going to have a problem finding someone to replace Biden before the next election. I don't think he has a chance of running. I don't think he has a chance of winning. No disrespect to the president. I think he's done a pretty good job as far as he could go, but he can't go any further. And so I think that the Democratic Party is going to have to do some soul searching and see who wants to be president. You remember a couple of years ago, there were about 20 people who wanted to be president of the Democratic Party, and about 20 people who want to be president of the Republican Party. Donald Trump's got a stranglehold on the Republican Party, and Biden doesn't have a natural successor. I doubt Senator Harris or Vice President Harris will be that successor. So we got this problem here. Now he's got really good legislation. It's just that it's going to be harder and harder to get it up. And it's going to be harder for the American people to give him credit for it. At the end of the day, it's going to look like a series of vicious compromises, or it's going to be watered down to the point it wasn't intended to do what it doesn't do what it was intended to do. But Biden knows these things. He's seen racial unrest. He has seen unnecessary wars. He has seen China relations close up. He has seen the failures in Iran and the failures in Iraq and all the rest. He knows these things, but he's not real sure what his world vision is. Just telling people you're back doesn't mean a thing unless you're going to do something about it. And the Europeans, they just don't trust them anymore. They don't trust America anymore. And fair enough, America has always done its own thing. Hopefully, every nation has to do what it has to do. But I think he would behoove him to show a little more interest in multilateralism. I mean, I think he should have made a stronger effort to re-engage the Iranians, who don't trust him either. And I think he should have made some effort to reach out to North Koreans. Apparently, there's an offer right now without preconditions, but North Korea requires personal diplomacy. I think Trump did a good job going to see Chairman Kim. He made it very clear to him, you can have your weapons, but just don't point them at me. And he hasn't pointed them at the United States since then. So I think Trump got the point across. So he's not going to do anything with the North Koreans, and he's not going to do anything with the Iranians. And he's getting further in the hole with the Chinese. He only had one phone call with them in 7 months. And some of the other engagements with China at other levels were sort of acrimonious. Didn't help very much. And I think the Chinese relationship is very important. But look, China's got 300 nuclear weapons. The thing I can't sleep about at night is that Vladimir Putin has 6,337 nuclear weapons. These are the big ones. He's got thousands of tactical nuclear weapons, and we never counted those. We never got around to counting those during the Cold War. So, he's got big problems on his hand. If someone decides to get out of control, or if there's a decision to roll the dice. So he's got, I think, 3 or 4 major problems. He's got to solve his domestic program. He's got to solve, or he's seen to be solving, the COVID problem, which is out of control now. Some Americans have identified wearing masks as imprisonment. I don't know how that works. I grew up with Jonas Salk, and a lot of my friends had polio, and then we took a polio shot in the early 50s, and then nobody got polio. It's pretty clear to us. Just take your shot and shut up. Go through life a little healthier than the guy next to you, maybe. And then he's got to deal with biodiversity. There's a big conference going on in China right now about species and other things falling off the limit, off the limb, which throws everything else out of kilter. And then he's got to deal with global poverty, which I mean by that, he's got to seem to be doing something with the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, all of which are very, very important. So he's got a big job in front of him. I don't know if he has all the right people around him. Most of the people around him have got some experience. They worked with President Obama and some even before that, but there's no one really on the horizon his horizon that is a major figure. I like to see as a Secretary of State is somebody who could have been president, but was never going to get there, or somebody who has a lot of connections with the world, somebody that they listen to. But to be fair to Secretary of State Blinken, he just doesn't have that kind of cachet. Well, I must say he speaks lovely French. So the point is, the president is going to stay in the doldrums. I don't see him getting out of it. I see a Republican Congress in 2022, it's going to be fairly resounding, I'm afraid. And I think the president is going to be impeached. There's going to be a lot of talk about it. And they're going to try to torture him the way the Democrats, unfortunately, tortured Trump. I didn't think they had to do that. I've seen these, what happens to a nation when they try to impeach people. After the attempted impeachment of Richard Nixon, the great journalist Walter Cronkite commented, there were two tragedies after President Nixon's resignation. Number one was the diminishing of the presidency, and number two was the diminishing of the press, because he said the press got the same gutter as Nixon. So people had very little respect for the press after that. And the same thing this last time around, when the press went after Trump. I mean, Trump could say anything he wants. But when you introduce everything he says as a guy who falsely claims, wrongfully accuses, the press is telling us what is proper, what's factual. As a professional historian, I always get a kick out of people who turn to facts. I mean, fact is a very slippery thing, depending on what side of the ball you're on. I had a great privilege one day in 1967 to be in the classroom with Martin Luther King, who came to talk to us, for some volunteers. He talked about facts. He said that he's talking about his going after the war in Vietnam. He said there are facts and there are facts. And he said, a fact is something from which there is incontrovertible evidence. And so he said you got to be very careful with the facts, because he was claiming that the United States was a worse enemy than North Vietnamese, and that you can't solve racism until you solve the war in Vietnam. And he'd gone the whole 9 yards. So the press is kind of not only loggerheads at the Republican Party, which is fine enough, but they report the news in such a way as that it's quite unpleasant. I don't want someone telling me that what somebody is saying is baseless, based on lies, and I don't want to hear it. Talk about allegations and charges and claims and all. I can figure out the rest. But right now, almost every press report in the United States is an editorial. I want an editorial, I go to the op-ed page. Fine. But I don't want the press telling me what I should be thinking. So I think Biden had a pretty good run in the first 100 days. Since then, it's been downhill. Now, some of these are his own faults. I think the job of president is just too big for one man or woman. It's just too big. He has to pretend to be on top of things over and over again. And as you can see from the hasty retreat from Kabul, which was a disaster. I don't care how anybody sugarcoats it. It was a disaster. That as soon as you operationalize something in the White House, or you leave it to your national security people, it's not going to work out very well. And then the next day, he says, we're going to get the bad guys. So they kill 10 people, 10 kids in somebody's family with a drone that's in the wrong place. I mean, we just go from one thing to another. And I'm sorry we left Afghanistan that way. I'm sorry we left 10 million Afghan women and girls in the Stone Ages, because they're going right back to the Dark Ages of the 7th century. We made a lot of promises there, and we left. We did the same thing in South Vietnam. And in 1979, the United States turned its back on Taiwan. And then this. And so, I think there's more to reestablishing America's position than saying you're there. You actually have to show something for your time. But look, he may recover. I just don't think so. There are too many people who are gunning for him, and he's nowhere close to getting that majority again in the House or the Senate. So I think it's a downhill race for him right now. Who's going to replace him? I have absolutely no idea. But I do think at the end of the day, the president is dealing with issues that he saw as a young man. He saw them play out. So, he was there. He saw with his own eyes what was going on in America. And those problems, many of them have been mitigated, some of them have been improved, but they haven't been solved yet. Inequality in American life, the racial injustice, the social injustice, and the indifference to elderly Americans and Medicaid and Medicare and all the rest of it. You got to lift this game, as a matter of fact. So he's got a lot of work to do, but he's running out of allies. And I think most people in the Democratic Party are seeing him as a liability rather than an asset in his last 2 years. I think they're starting to distance themselves from this guy. And, he hasn't done much with the borders, and he hasn't done much with social justice, with the police reform business. And he hasn't been able to deliver on things through no fault of his own. So sometimes I think we overestimate what a president can do. Some of them can do a great deal. In the case of John Kennedy, when he died, he never really knew what he was going to do. And there was that wonderful eulogy by the French ambassador who called John Kennedy a brilliant maybe. Well, Joe Biden doesn't get to be a brilliant maybe. We get to judge him completely on his 4 years. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Joe. That's great. A big, wide sweep of questions, of issues you've covered. Some of the questions I'll bring up in a second, ask things that you've talked about already. Anybody wants to put some questions in, once again, go to Slido, slido.com, and you can put your questions in there. So I'll get straight into it, Joe, and try and do some really quick questions. Some of these questions sort of go together. Somebody was asking about can Biden bring in consensus decision-making to American governments, which is like saying, can you bring peace to the Middle East? I mean, one of the things he did talk about, when he talked about normalcy and decency, that's what Biden promised, he had that experience in the Senate and hence could work across the aisle. So is there any evidence that he's able to do any of that and bring some consensus decision-making, or is he basically going to have to crash through to try and get some of his bills through?
Well, his promise was to unify the American people through compromise. And he hasn't been able to do that because he just doesn't have the numbers. And I don't think he has the deftness. Now, they say he could work with the Dixiecrats and things like that. And he was an early chairman of the Judiciary Committee and some other committees. He's had other important committees. But keep in mind, he interviewed Anita Hill. Sitting next to him was Ted Kennedy. Now, there's a guy who left a woman at the bottom of a drink, checked into a motel, and tried to get some schlep to take the blame for it. So, if Biden wasn't on his highest moral plane, I could see why. He's surrounded by people who just want to survive. And so, Ted Kennedy's kind of glowered at him the whole time during the proceedings. And whether he did the right thing or wrong thing, I don't know. But the point is, he never rose to a great occasion. There is no famous speech by Joe Biden. Now, we hear the usual refrains. My wife died, my son died, and we all bury people. And my father used to say, and my mother used to say. We all know what it is by heart right now. But he's not famous for anything other than longevity. And, maybe that's what you got to do. You got to run the whole race to be the winner. At the end of the day, he struck me, because he lost the first 3 primaries, he struck me as a default president. He was the one that least complaint about, and the guy most likely to beat Donald Trump. And of course, Donald Trump was well on his way to beating himself. Okay.
You've got a couple of questions similar. You talked about whether you thought Biden would go the whole term. I think you actually mentioned that. So firstly, you don't think he's going to go for a second term, clearly. Do you think he'll even go the whole term? And secondly, I asked a question about Vice President Harris. You said you didn't think she was a credible second term candidate. We haven't heard anything about her. What's happening with her?
Well, I mean, her first job was to go to the border and clean it up. He gave her an impossible job. 100,000 people coming in, 10,000 from Haiti alone, and she wasn't able to do much about it. And so they revert to the old story. We had to inherit Trump's policy to the border, et cetera, et cetera. And look, she was my first choice when she was running for president. I thought she had a lot of potential, but she's ducked for cover on the big issues. And I don't know what's frightened her off, et cetera. And she, in many ways, he might not go the whole distance. If he is, for example, if he's impeached, they might get enough Republicans to scare him off or something like that. I don't think he's going to go the distance. And you know as well as I do, John, certain jobs age you very quickly. And being president of the United States, I would think would age anybody. It's a tough job, and you're overwhelmed, and you're surrounded by people who frankly aren't very good. He's got a lot of newbies in these secretaries' positions who are just finding their way around. He didn't bring in a lot of famous people with him. He didn't bring in any alpha women or men who could head up departments, etc. I just don't think he's getting the help he wanted to. He was very interested in diversification. That's fine. America likes to represent itself along all kinds of lines, but I don't think he's got the support that he needs, and he might not go the distance. And I'll tell you what, and your audience might even feel this. I had this feeling from Trump. Trump seemed like more than 4 years to me. Every week with Trump was breathtaking. He'd wear everybody out, and same thing with Biden. It seems like the presidency is being elongated, or in terms of intensity. I think you kind of wear people out. I mean, you can't go from a disaster in Kabul one day to solving the mask problem the next. A mask problem is a big problem in America. And last week I watched the Georgia Bulldogs play a football game with 90,000 people in the stadium, and nobody was wearing a mask. Same thing at Notre Dame Stadium, 70,000 people, no one's wearing a mask. Or same thing with the World Series or division games. I mean, what's going on? Mask is a big deal, and Americans don't care about the mask. So what do they know that we don't know? And the answer is they're not getting much leadership on this. And to be fair to him, it's up to the governors to make a lot of this stuff happen. But he's promised some things that he hasn't delivered on. But I don't hold him accountable to the downturn in the pandemic. And I hope, like everybody else, there isn't a third variant that comes along and wipes out the vaccines.
One of the things, of course, institutionally that makes leaning across the aisle and getting consensus to happen is the filibuster. There's a couple of questions about the filibuster. There has been some discussion about it. I mean, what's the current state of play there, and what if anything might happen on trying to stop the filibuster in the Senate to try and get some legislation through?
Well, the Republicans used the nuclear option. That is, they got rid of the 60 to get their own guy up for two people up for the Supreme Court. So they put it off the table. Look, that 60 vote would confuse a lot of Australians, confuses a lot of Americans too. If you got the vote, why do you need 60? And the 60 is one of these things that's in place. It's really kind of like a tennis rule or a football rule that's in place. That if you want major legislation, you should get at least 10 of the other guys to come along. And it's just kind of a polite thing to do. The filibuster is long gone in terms of what it was used for originally. It was talking down civil rights legislation and the like. But it may be brushed aside. The only trouble is the Republicans will then ramrod a number of things through when they get in. So it was always kept as kind of a level playing field, get everyone to play nice. Now, to get this second bill up, this $3.5 trillion, you're going to need more Democratic senators to come to the party. And they might even turn to the getting rid of the filibuster on this one, call it the reconciliation package, to get it through. But what it tells everybody is that the gloves are off. And when you do something today, I could do the same thing tomorrow, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. So what they're doing is they should be looking into the future. But as I mentioned, most Americans don't expect much from Congress. I don't think Congress expects much from Congress. And sometimes I don't know what the hell they're doing. When I was a kid and I went to see Congress, I saw guys in $2,000 suits and $200 haircuts who had nothing to say. I didn't know what they were doing. And they all go to Congress as poor men, and they all leave Congress as millionaires. What's that all about? It's perplexing to a lot of people.
Could he turn his popularity around if he managed to get those two big spending bills through somehow, by twisting arms or doing deals in the background and bring back the cost a little bit? If he got those two big spending bills through, would that give him something then to campaign on over the next year to get to the midterms?
Well, if he doesn't get both of them through, along the original lines that he proposed, he will lose. The progressives, who now constitute 1/4 of the Democratic Party, won't let him get away with that. They will probably stop one or maybe both bills. So I don't think he's going to be able to turn that around. And frankly, after the Kabul thing, I think there's a lot of Americans that simply aren't going to forgive him, as a matter of fact. And look, I'll tell you what my beef is with Biden and the guy before him and the guy before him. These bills are designed to give working class people a job, a future. They could buy a home and a car and all that. The American dream. He's even offering them more tax credits, free this and that. And he's telling them that they have to do these things, as well as climate change, to make America competitive, to play the globalization game. And my complaint is the last 30 years, nobody in Congress and leadership has explained to the working class people what globalization means to them. It was the elites never bothered to explain it. So when you lost your job in Youngstown, Ohio, or you saw your car job in Detroit go to Mexico, you don't have any great feeling for globalization. So he's asking all these people to work very hard at making America compete globally. And they're not seeing the point on this thing. And I don't blame him. He hasn't explained to them. And he's also telling them that we're going to help you get these jobs. And you're going to be the next generation of so-called immigrants, the ones who built the roads. My father's people came over. And you're going to be the new blue-collar people. Now, about 60% of Americans do not have an education, a university education. And I have been arguing, and we all know this from our own fathers and our grandfathers, there's a big mistake among politicians to imagine that people without a university education are unintelligent. You see, Trump plays on this a little bit, but only by accident. They found him, he didn't find them. And so there's a lot of people in the Democratic Party who are a little snobby these days. I know I was in the Democratic. It wasn't always like this. It was blue collar, white collar, and pink collar. That was it. Working class people. But today, they kind of look down their noses at them, these elites. And I think that's the problem in the Democratic Party, is that they're out of touch with the ordinary people who have common cause with the Democratic Party. So that's been my beef. Okay, any questions on Taiwan?
No, but there's a couple of questions on international relations to some extent. Somebody said, in one word, can you please describe the American strategy in Afghanistan? That might be a bit tricky, but maybe in one sentence.
It was a dud. Look, you go there to get bin Laden, and then bin Laden escapes. Then you decide to do the one thing the Republicans didn't want to do, was to go into nation building. And then we all get into nation building. And I just think it's obscene to encourage an entire generation of Afghans to take their place in society and then to pull the rug out from under them. No, you can't stay forever. I know that. There is no such thing as a forever war. There's a forever loss in your mind of a war. There's only necessary wars and wars of choice. But I think abandoning the Afghans to these people and their 7th century Sharia law concepts, it offends me. I mean, what are we doing? We have all these bloody crocodile tears for everybody who suffers around the world, and we turn our back on 10 million women and girls who are back home. And the judiciary women are being chased. The sports teams are run out of the country. Everyone's running for their lives. It reminds me of when the communists went into Afghanistan in '79. They were greeted as liberators, get rid of the monarchy and all that kind of thing. And there are people who actually felt liberated to make movies and get into music or whatever it is that socialism does for these people. And there's a great story when there was a rumor for just a minute that the communist revolution had been reversed, and hundreds of communists, Afghan communists, and the symbol of communism for a man was a mustache. They shaved off their mustache because they didn't want to be killed. And then when the Communist Party leaders found out that they'd shaved off their mustache, it was in fact a false rumor. They rounded these guys up and executed them as being traitors. So things change very quickly there. But look, I saw it in Vietnam. We turned our back. And And I saw it again in 79 when we walked away from Taiwan. And I saw it again here. And it's 3 times in my lifetime, we've turned our back on people who counted on us. And, I know there are reasons for it and all the rest of it, but we left them in the lurch.
Well, speaking of people who turning your back on people who you're counting on, somebody asked about Australia. We haven't talked too much about Australia, but Australian governments always assume we must support every US, war that they're involved in, no matter what, because if we don't, the US will ignore us if we're in trouble. So, are we the 4th one? You said it happened 3 times. Are we the 4th one that they might?
No, Americans, strangely enough, have a kind of a love affair with Australia. That's because they don't know much about Australia. Australia is, it used to be Chips Rafferty and Errol Flynn and the America's Cup and that kind of thing, and Crocodile Dundee. Americans kind of have an image of Australians as actors and sportsmen and the like, and they don't understand the rough and tumble of Australian life. They won't turn on them that way. But look, when I arrived, I in this country, I got to meet all your prime ministers except Tony Abbott, and got to interview them and talk to them in seminars. And when I found out the things that were going on, Menzies goes to Congress and gives his famous speech about we're with you through thick and thin. And then the Harold Holt says, all the way with LBJ. He was drunk at the White House. And then Gordon comes along. Gordon's a very sensible guy who talks about wherever you go, we'll go waltzing Matilda with you. I mean, you couldn't invent this kind of stuff. So Australia has been very close to America. The Labour Party wasn't quite sure what this all meant in the 1980s, but by the late 80s, they had teamed up to the ANZUS Treaty. And the ANZUS Treaty is this wonderful document that means everything and means nothing. It's an antique, it's like a 1952 Chevrolet. Doesn't mean anything more because the Cold War is over and Japan's not about to rearm or anything like that. But America has been counting on Australia over the years, and they're interoperable. They use the same bullets. They're installed in each other's staff, et cetera, et cetera. So, in many ways, Americans regard Australia, and I don't want to insult anybody, as the 51st American state. They just can count on them. They can just count on them. Now,
the 52nd, I thought Britain thought themselves as the 51st.
Well, no, and Britain's getting smaller and smaller. Look, the General Eisenhower, when he was president, counted on Australia to sort of instruct the United States and Southeast Asia. That's his special security advisor to Australians have a very close connection with that part. They can help us understand it. Australians, that's how they hit above their weight. They understand certain parts of the world better than the Americans do. And so, but there's this affinity, and China made it very clear a couple months ago that if Australia assists the United States in defending Taiwan, Australia can expect ballistic missiles on their military bases. Very clear. We regard you as one. Now, with the submarines, we're all in bed together on this one. But when I hear Australians talk about going to war over Taiwan, when no American's going to go to war over Taiwan, I'm thinking, what are you talking about? No one mentions the Shanghai Communique, which makes it very clear that Taiwan is off the table. So when I hear Australians on certain networks I won't mention talk about the coming war with China over Taiwan, I think maybe they ought to have a cold shower or something and cool off, because that ain't going to happen. Now, if Americans lead people to believe they're going to go to war over Taiwan, that's a sucker bet, because it ain't going to happen. So, but when I see Australians taking the lead, I'm thinking, I'd be a little careful about this, because you're going to incur the wrath of the Chinese. And I mean, look at Australian diplomacy. No one in China will answer the phone for a minister, and no one in France will answer the phone for a minister. So Australia's Europe and China don't want to talk to us.
Okay.
So, that's the price you pay.
Sure. 2 last questions from me. One is, you haven't mentioned the Supreme Court yet. Of course, that was a huge issue this time last year. How's the new Trump sort of dominated or Republican dominated Supreme Court been over its first 10 months since the most recent appointment?
Well, I think there are mixed reviews. Most legal experts I listen to on PBS say that the people Trump appointed didn't necessarily go with Trump's policies. And I think once you appoint a man or a woman to a job for the rest of their lives, no strings attached, I think they become very independent. Look at Earl Warren. He was supposed to be, the great conservative on Eisenhower's court, and he becomes the great liberal. These people, they march to their own drummer and they do their own thing. Now we're going to be talking about the death penalty and we're going to talk about Roe versus Wade. But keep in mind that when we talk about pro-life or whatever it is, we're talking about people who have to use federal money to get an abortion. People who have their local friendly doctors, they don't worry about that kind of thing. This is about affecting certain kinds of people. But I think the Supreme Court has worked out pretty well. And I'll tell you what, if Ruth had resigned when she was too old, we wouldn't have had a problem. She sort of enjoyed the limelight too much. So there's a little cautionary tale for us people about when to quit. If she quit on time, there wouldn't have been a constitutional crisis.
Okay, well, we're doing very well on time, so we've got one last question, then we'll quit on time. You did talk a little bit there about this. A lot of this stuff depends actually on what happens in your own state, and what that also depends a lot on what happens in the electoral system. One of the things that they've tried to go through Congress is, because as we know, Australians look at this with astonishment and bewilderment, the way the American electoral system works, where every state does their own thing and often elected officials are in charge. And as we know, there's a massive sort of voter suppression sort of campaign by many states. Is there anything that Congress can, or the president executive orders can actually do? Because otherwise, I guess you could find in November next year, in some of those states controlled by Republicans, they'll just basically suppress the vote of the people they don't like and manage to get across the line. I mean that's maybe me cynical, but that's obviously voter rights is a huge issue in America. So where's that going to head?
Well, look, I've lived in a number of American states, and I think at the state level, a lot of those people in charge of electoral process, I think they're they have a great deal of integrity and pride in what they do. I don't think these people are the puppets of the federal government. If anything, they don't really care what the federal government. They run their own show. Sort of like Queensland, not interested in anything else. So I think we can count on them, to be honest. Now, look, I grew up in Cook County, Chicago, and Mayor Daley's exhortation to us was, vote early and vote often. And, he bought the vote, because if you didn't win the vote, those 50,000 civil servants or firemen or cops that could lose their jobs. They're all patronage jobs. So there's a great deal of interest in keeping things smooth at that level. And I don't think anybody's stupid enough to turn the election over to the federal government or pick their guy because someone told them to do so. I think at that level, people take a great deal of pride. And I'll tell you what, no one's going to jail for Donald Trump. I mean, they're just not going to do it. They're not even going to take a chance.
Okay, fair enough. Well, look, once again, Joe, it's a pleasure having you as our speaker. And also thank you so much for doing this at 8 o'clock on a Friday night. I know you've lost all sense of time by being in lockdown, but we know it's 8 o'clock over there. So it's been very generous of you to do the talk for us again today. We've had a couple of comments come through already on the Slido saying, what a great talk. Thanks very much for being so frank.
If anybody wants to follow up anything, feel free to send me an email. Happy to take it up again. I'm glad to do that. Now I'm going to tell you a secret. Before I came on your show, I did a 3-hour podcast and I taped in London on my screen here. So this is about 4 hours running. And I was afraid my voice was going to give out. But this is a pleasure. I'm locked down. It's cold outside. And there ain't nothing to do. So this is just a treat, okay? Just a treat.
It was a treat for us as well. So thank you so much. And hopefully we'll see. Maybe we'll talk to you in a year's time and talk about the midterms. Okay?
Well, I tell you what, I'd like to do the next one in Perth, if you guys let us in.
Yeah, that'd be nice, wouldn't it? Excellent. Okay. Well, look, for everybody else watching, thank you very much for sticking with it till this time. And it was great having you here. Next week, we have another Curtin Corner. It's two people from Curtin and here in Bentley, Associate Professor Caroline Flay and Mr. Salim Askari, who will be talking about Australia's response to people seeking asylum in the midst of COVID-19. So they're people from also from our Faculty of Humanities, where Joe is adjunct professor. So please tune in next Friday at 4 o'clock Western time, and we'll see you then. So once again, thanks for Syracuse, and we'll see you all at a future Curtin Corner. Thanks very much.
Good evening.
Good night.